So after the huge success of Metal Gear Solid in both domestic and international markets, Konami did what all the best publishers did in the late 90s. Started work on a handheld spin-off for the Game Boy Color. The game would be called Metal Gear Ghost Babel in Japan and simply Metal Gear Solid in international releases, and it would be set in a separate, non-canon continuity from the main series, with the game's story being an alternate sequel to the original Metal Gear. So does Metal Gear Ghost Babel manage to successfully translate what made Metal Gear Solid so special to the Game Boy? Or is it just another handheld spin-off that deserves to be left in the past? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 5th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Metal Gear game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along in preparation for Metal Gear Delta. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them. So I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Metal Gear Ghost Babel is an action-adventure stealth game developed and published by Konami and released for the Game Boy Color in 2000. And to give the basic setup for the story, the game takes place 7 years after the original Metal Gear in a timeline where Snake left Foxhound immediately after that mission in Outer Heaven, meaning that the events of Metal Gear 2 and onwards never occurred in this continuity. Snake gets called in by Roy Campbell after a plane on a top-secret mission was shot down over South America, allowing terrorists to capture a new prototype Metal Gear that the US was developing. Intelligence says that Metal Gear was taken to Gindra, a small nation in Central Africa, which also just so happens to have been the same country that Big Boss converted into Outer Heaven all those years ago. They need us to infiltrate the Gallowade base in Gindra to rescue the Metal Gear research team, which they believe are being held hostage, as well as destroy Metal Gear itself. We're also informed of a group known as the Gindran Liberation Front, or GLF for short, who are fighting to gain independence from the United States, with intelligence saying that they're likely the ones who stole Metal Gear. So Campbell asks Snake to help him out with one last mission, telling us that he has an old score to settle here. And the first thing I noticed with this game is how shockingly story-heavy it is. I mean, sure, it was supposed to essentially be Metal Gear Solid on the Game Boy, but I've just never played a Game Boy game with this much story content before. I mean, hell, the introductory cutscene of the game is 14 minutes long. And that's not including the cutscene and dialogue after you start a new game. It takes 14 minutes to even reach the main menu when first booting up the game. And in this intro, we also get introduced to the rest of our allies. Mei Ling being pretty much the exact same as she was in Metal Gear Solid, Weasel, one of the best mercenaries in the world, who is on the mission to give Snake advice in case he's too rusty from years of retirement, and Brian McBride, a CIA agent who was the director of operations of African Affairs, who is on the mission to offer insight into the country of Gindra as we go. But when we do finally get into the game, we get a nice little hit of nostalgia right off the bat. And this isn't the only song pulled over from the older games in the series either, with another noteworthy one being that the alert theme from Metal Gear 2 is present in this game as well, which is an interesting choice because if you ask me, Metal Gear 2 has the weakest alert theme in the franchise, but it's still charming that they brought it back nonetheless. I was also shocked early on by how great the sprite and animation work was. I genuinely don't think I've ever seen a Game Boy Color game that looks this damn good. The sprites are high quality, the colors are fantastic, and the animations are just so smooth. As far as the gameplay itself though, it's relatively unchanged from the previous games in the series. You'll run around the base while trying to avoid detection from guards, potentially shooting them with a suppressed weapon or knocking them out to get around them more quickly, and in the event you do get spotted, running away to hide and wait for them to stop searching. But that's an interesting change from the 2D games in particular here, as you can no longer actually fight your way out of alerts in this game. In Metal Gear 2, you had the option to hide or fight, not being forced into one or the other, but here, if you do kill an enemy that's coming after you, the game will simply just spawn another one from a doorway or something and have them continue to pursue you. And while I get that they want to force you into a more stealth-heavy playstyle, I think that this is a pretty negative change, as it makes all weapons in this game, aside from your suppressed pistol, basically useless unless you need to use them for a specific boss fight. And while we're on that note, the combat might actually be the worst of the 2D Metal Gears here. It's mostly the same, but there are a couple changes that make it feel notably worse than in the first few entries. First of all, they've carried over the change from Metal Gear Solid where pressing the fire button will stop Snake from moving, except for unlike Metal Gear Solid, there's no alternate input to allow you to run and shoot together, meaning that Snake just has to stand still in order to shoot in this game. And the enemy AI only makes the combat more frustrating with this incredibly annoying bash attack that they'll do whenever you're remotely close to them, that also happens to have way more range than you might think. These things together make it so that if I try to stand my ground and fight, I'm frustrated, and if I try to run away, I'm also frustrated, leading to the alerts being way more irritating here than in any game in the franchise so far. But for a positive addition to the gameplay, they've added the ability to stick to walls that was present in Metal Gear Solid, which, while it's not necessary for peeking around corners like it was in that game, it does allow for the developers to make these crawl spaces that only Snake can fit through, and use those spaces to create some surprisingly engaging puzzles. And speaking of surprises, there's the most unexpected gameplay change of all: the levels. See, instead of having one large interconnected world like all the previous games, Ghost Babel uses much more traditional stages that are completely separated from one another. This is a huge departure from the series' usual exploration structure, and I'm assuming that it was done because of limitations of the Game Boy, but honestly, I really enjoyed it. I wouldn't necessarily say that I prefer this to the interconnected levels and backtracking of previous games, but I really enjoyed having these smaller areas that I would explore for 30 minutes or so before moving on to the next one. It even comes complete with a performance rating for each level when you complete them, which I always scored great on. After exploring some of the earlier areas, we get a call from Chris Jenner, a member of Delta Force, who we were meant to rendezvous with after arriving in Gindra. She tells us that Delta Force was ambushed and that she believes she's the only member to have survived. We tell her that we'll try to meet up with her soon before the rest of our allies get on the line and start considering the possibility that there may be a spy in our ranks. This is a top secret mission, so the only way the enemy would have known Delta Force had even infiltrated the base to begin with would be if they had been tipped off. And speaking of the codec, I was also pleasantly surprised to see that this thing is absolutely full of optional calls for extra lore and world building. And sure, this is nothing new for the series, a couple of the previous games have done this, but there's a ton of extra information about the events of the game and the characters themselves that you can learn if you just call them from time to time. And not only did it impress me that they had so much extra lore, world building, and character development packed into this little handheld spin-off, but I also found learning about this version of Metal Gear's world so much more interesting knowing that it's a whole separate continuity from the mainline games. And despite being limited to 2D again, the game still manages to make time for a bunch of new creative set pieces. One of my favorites was really early on in the game, where while Snake is moving through the sewers, a squall comes through, causing massive waves of water to rush through the sewers. This means that players have to frantically run from ladder to ladder through here to get to higher ground and not be killed by the surges of water. And while it's nothing all that crazy, it's just one of those little moments that goes a long way in shaking up the gameplay and helps a lot with the pacing. Which, as we'll come back to later, Ghost Babel can use all the help there it can get. And while we're talking about things that the team managed to do well regardless of the hardware limitations, let's shake it up and talk about something that they didn't manage to overcome. Swapping between inventory items in this game is as bad as it's ever been in the Metal Gear games. To swap between your items, you simply cycle through them one at a time, but even by the end of the first few levels, you'll notice that finding the item you're looking for is already a pain in the ass. And don't even get me started on the end of the game. I'm assuming they didn't use a menu like the old 2D games because they were trying to do what Metal Gear Solid did and not break up the gameplay, but it just doesn't work here since you can't see what items you're cycling to next, meaning it's really easy to go past what you're looking for before you even realize it was there in the first place. This definitely could have been avoided by using a more traditional item menu, or like I said in the Metal Gear Solid video, color coding the items a little more to make them easier to recognize at a glance. None of the Metal Gear games have totally nailed the item swapping thing yet, but I would say that Ghost Babel has the worst swapping in the series, which is a real shame. Anyway, we managed to meet up with Chris, with her telling us that only one of the Metal Gear researchers is still alive, and that member is James Harks, the chief engineer of the Metal Gear project. She then tells us about a bunch of mercenaries that the GLF hired, a group known as Black Chamber. This group is made up of a handful of mercenaries which all possess abilities significantly beyond that of your average soldier, and they're also rumored to have once been US Special Forces. She then explains to us that the people of Gindra don't take very kindly to Americans being there because the leader of the GLF, simply known as the General, has been working towards the country's independence from the United States, something that the citizens of Gindra are mostly in support of. And it was at about this point in the game that I realized why the movement felt so much better than in the previous 2D games. Sure, the animations helped a lot, but the game also has omnidirectional movement, which in more simple terms means that you can move in the 4 cardinal directions as well as move diagonally by pressing a horizontal and a vertical input at the same time. It felt so natural in this game that I didn't even consciously notice it until I was about an hour in, and it really just helps the game feel so much smoother and less dated than the MSX or NES games in the series. But moving on, we reach the first boss of the game, and this is Slasher Hawk, one of the 4 members of Black Chamber. And this is a pretty fun fight. We're cut off from Hawk by a small cliff, and he throws his boomerangs down at us while we have to lob grenades back up at him. It's really well designed too, with the color of the boomerang that he throws communicating which of the various attack patterns it will use, allowing you to learn what each color boomerang does and react accordingly as soon as you see that color. After defeating Hawk, we get the now classic final monologue from him, telling us his background and how he ended up working for Black Chamber. And he has a particularly touching backstory, even if it's nothing significant to the game's overall plot, and from here we continue the search for James Harkes. And unfortunately, this is about the point in the game where the level design starts to fall apart. The early levels are fine, mostly because of their simplicity, but from this point on, things get a little esoteric. The first level that made me realize this was this one here, where you need to slowly travel across these conveyor belts, changing the color of the box as you go through these sorting devices to change what direction you're going in. Checking all the various paths you can go down with these sorting devices not only takes a ton of time because of how slow the conveyor belt goes, but it's even worse as most paths will drop you down to a lower floor of the building, meaning you'll need to work your way back through the facility and take the elevator back to the top floor to even try again. There's a few levels like this in the game that are just overly confusing and time-consuming, and I would definitely say that level design is one of this game's largest weaknesses. And that's really a shame because how enjoyable your levels are to move through is one of the most make or break things in game design as a whole. But at the end of the conveyor belt gauntlet, we find where Harkes is being held, and he ends up being just a kid, also telling us to call him Jimmy. He tells us that the wall on the east of his cell sounds weak, so we use some C4 to blow our way in, freeing him in the process. He then tells us that Metal Gear is in the maintenance facility of the base, and that it's already functional and likely just going through its final tests. He also then mentions overhearing something about a Project Babel, but he doesn't know any of the details about it. The power then suddenly goes out, and Jimmy says that it's likely because they're diverting all the power to Metal Gear so that they can fire a nuke out of its railgun, a concept that's returning from Metal Gear Solid. So we call Chris, asking her to take over protecting Jimmy while we go after Metal Gear. And this scene is also where I noticed a very subtle detail in the game's dialogue and cutscenes. The pitch of the text scrolling sound effect will change based on who's speaking, allowing the developers to very subtly change how you interpret that character's speech. Occasionally, a character's scrolling sound will even change mid-scene as well, allowing them to reflect the tone of the scene through basic sound design. But moving on, we encounter the second member of Black Chamber, Marionette Owl. She fights in the dark as she has natural night vision and also controls 2 life-size dolls to fight alongside her, hence the whole marionette thing. The player is required to wear night vision goggles to spot her out from her dolls so that we can actually deal damage to her, but we're also required to avoid the flashbang she throws by taking them back off just before the explosion. It's an okay boss fight, it's not great, it's not bad, it just kind of sits in the middle. But once we deal enough damage to Owl, we get another long monologue with her throwing in an interesting mention of Black Chamber's leader, Viper, wanting to get his revenge on someone that they call Anonymous. She dies just before she can explain what she means, and we're forced to simply move on. And right as we're getting to where Metal Gear is going to launch from, Viper suddenly ambushes us in a hind, stopping us in our tracks and forcing us to watch as they fire a nuke at America. Immediately after the launch, we also get shot at by artillery, forcing us to retreat and leave Metal Gear alone for now. And this is the first time in a Metal Gear game where it feels like we truly lost. Sure, there were smaller losses in some of the previous games, but nothing to the scale of sitting there watching a nuke get fired at the United States. However, we then get a call from Campbell letting us know that the warhead hit the States, but it ended up being a fake that was simply meant to warn us. The GLF general sends a message to the president, giving him 3 hours to pull all UN troops out of the nation and recognize their sovereignty, or they will fire a real nuclear warhead at the States next time. We call Chris, asking her to put Jimmy on the line, and he explains that we can prevent it from firing again by simply destroying the power plant so its railgun can't charge up. But as he's explaining this, we suddenly hear gunshots and lose contact with him and Chris. We make our way to the power plant before Chris manages to call us back, telling us that Jimmy was recaptured by the enemy, but she managed to slip away unharmed. We tell her that we'll rescue him once we're sure that Metal Gear can't fire another nuke, and we continue to find a way to destroy the generator. Along the way, we fight with Pyro Bison, the third member of Black Chamber. And this guy honestly gets one of the most badass introductions of any boss in the series so far. He tells us before the fight that every human burns differently. The way their skin scorches, the fat burns, the innards char, and there, in the way that the person burns, you can see the burdens of their sin. It's metal as fuck, and I actually smiled at it while playing just because of how genuinely cool that line is. And his fight is very similar to Vulcan Raven from Metal Gear Solid, with us being completely outmatched by him in pure strength, but with there being creative ways around it. I don't think that Bison's fight is as well designed, as you can just use grenades if you really want to get it done the easy way, but it's still fun and leaves a lot of room for creativity. After defeating him, he answers some of our questions about Black Chamber. He explains that Black Chamber was a special operations team formed by the United States that was created to carry out all of the Black Ops that Foxhound would have had after Snake destroyed Metal Gear. But because of Snake and the rest of Foxhound's fame after that mission, Black Chamber just had to take on all of the US's darkest operations, and they never got any credit for their work as none of that information could leak to the public. Snake tells him that he never wanted to be a legend before Bison retorts that Snake always went out of his way to take the difficult missions, and since he arrived on base, he'd already killed 89 people, meaning that he surely wants it deep down. He then reveals that Black Chamber actually has 5 surviving members, not 4, and that one of them is a spy among our ranks, and that they've known what our plan was every step of the way. We call Campbell to tell him this, and he reassures us that there is no spy, and that Bison was just trying to confuse and divide us before he died, before telling us to continue on with destroying the power plant. So we set a bunch of C4 around the plant, targeting the weaker foundations around the generator itself, and as we're about to leave, Metal Gear gets rolled out again and starts to power up. So in order to prevent a launch, we take the risk of blowing the C4 while we're still inside to ensure that it can't fire, leading to a set piece where we need to flee from the power plant as it falls apart. We get another message from the general, who says that he's disappointed by us not fulfilling their request, and assuring us that he can still fire the warhead without using the railgun. And a little ways out from the power plant, we find Jimmy standing next to a dead body, who ends up being the lieutenant of Delta Force. Not only does this mean that Chris isn't the only surviving member of Delta Force, but Jimmy also says that Chris apparently wasn't with her team when they were wiped out by Black Chamber. He then tells us that he thinks making Metal Gear was a mistake and that he just wants to go home and start his life over, working on things that help people instead of things that destroy. We ask him if it's true that Metal Gear can fire a nuke without the railgun, and he confirms that it can, but just as he's about to explain it to us, his handcuffs explode, suddenly killing him. And I've gotta say, the team that made Ghost Babel definitely has some balls to blow up a literal child right in front of Snake. Most game developers definitely wouldn't do that. After this, we come into contact with a woman that we don't get a clear look at, but who seems to be Chris, who quickly jumps into a hind and attacks us. And this is one of the more awkward boss fights in the game, with the player needing to either time their grenade tosses properly to hit the chopper with them, or just run away from it and use Nikita missiles to wear it down. But when we shoot it down, it's revealed that the pilot wasn't Chris, and it was in fact Sophie, the general's second in command. She reveals that the GLF have known Black Chamber's plan to get revenge all along and are simply exploiting them for their own gain. She then tells Snake that Chris is still alive and has been taken prisoner by Viper before we let her go and move on to stop Metal Gear. We get to the maintenance facility where Metal Gear is being stored, and this is where the game's pacing goes completely out the window. I mentioned the conveyor belt earlier, but this facility is on a whole other level. Complete with things like a maze where you have to find weak points in the walls while avoiding floor traps, instant death trap rooms, guaranteed alerts, really just whatever the designers could throw at you to slow you down. But we finally make our way down to the 100th level of the maintenance facility's basement, a callback to the original Metal Gear, only for Metal Gear itself to walk away just as we arrive. We chase it down the hallway before being confronted by Viper. He explains that 2 years ago, Black Chamber was sent into South America to recover Metal Gear from terrorists, which the government had already been working on reproducing for years at that point. They were successful in their mission, but the government didn't want the world to know about the existence of either Black Chamber or Metal Gear. So on Black Chamber's return to the States, the government had Foxhound attack Black Chamber, killing all but 5 of their members. He also shows us that Chris is still alive just before starting to fight with us. And in my opinion, this is easily the best boss fight in the game. Viper is a demolitions expert, so every few seconds, the room will fill with randomized tripwires between the pillars that then turn invisible after being placed, forcing the player to remember where those wires are and navigate around the room very carefully while chasing Viper from corner to corner. After we finally defeat him, he attempts to blow up the room to take us with him, but we manage to escape with Chris. Chris then explains to us that the reason she wasn't with Delta Force when Black Chamber attacked them was because she had been ordered by the army chief himself to wipe any evidence of America's involvement with Metal Gear, the assassinations of Black Chamber, anything that they couldn't afford to have leaked to the public. We move forward, coming face to face with the general himself piloting Metal Gear. He monologues to us for a while before casually mentioning that there's a connection between the GLF and the US government, and when Snake asks him what he means, he says that he'll tell him what that connection is if he wins before attacking him with Metal Gear. And the Metal Gear fight in this game is kinda bullshit. It starts out with us being chased down a long hallway by him, with us needing to place landmines or C4 wherever the foot is going to land. But the problem is that the amount of time the foot's shadow will hover before actually planting is randomized, so it's literally just a guessing game to try to deal damage here. After this, there's a much longer second phase where we need to deal damage to Metal Gear's weak points while avoiding its machine guns, laser turrets, missile barrages, flamethrower, just anything that it could possibly throw at us. But after many attempts and a very long and difficult fight, we managed to destroy Metal Gear. With the general dying in front of us, Snake demands the information that he mentioned earlier, and the general then reveals that Outer Heaven itself was a US-backed venture that provided mercenaries to clients before Big Boss decided to break from the program and start a revolution. We were simply sent in all those years ago to silence Big Boss and his mercenaries. But the real connection between the GLF and the US government is that the GLF was created by the US in order to provoke African countries into fighting one another, keeping them occupied fighting amongst themselves so that they wouldn't be able to band together and try to overthrow America. And before dying, he hands us a disc containing every piece of information that the army chief sent Chris in to purge, allowing us to take evidence of all of the general's claims back to the West with us. The general dies, and Viper suddenly appears standing on top of Metal Gear. He reveals to us that Campbell was involved in the assassinations of Black Chamber before Campbell calls in, quickly being knocked out by McBride, who reveals himself to be the 5th member of Black Chamber. Viper then initiates a secret launch sequence in Metal Gear, activating nuclear-equipped satellites in orbit, telling us that we have 90 seconds before 7 nuclear detonations are set off in the US. We then battle with Viper one last time before we manage to kill him and stop the launch with only a few seconds to spare. We get a call from Campbell again, and Weasel tells us that he shot and killed McBride in self-defense. However, Weasel then reveals that he's working for the original CIA director who had started Outer Heaven and the Metal Gear project to begin with, and that they had orchestrated all the events of this story in order to regain control of the project. He was also, of course, tasked with killing our whole team once the mission was over, but he has a change of heart and decides to let us all go instead, saying that he'll make up a story to tell his boss about how we all escaped. And finally, we ride off with Chris into the sunset, and the game is over. So like I said at the beginning of the video, the story here is surprisingly strong. I didn't love it quite as much as Metal Gear Solid, but I think it's my second favorite Metal Gear story so far, and it's definitely the highlight of the game in my opinion. It has good characters, good writing, great twists and turns throughout, and the amazing artwork is just a cherry on top. And overall, Metal Gear Ghost Babel is a really interesting game. The story and the core gameplay is honestly really good, and this is probably one of, if not the strongest title I've ever played on the Game Boy, but the level design and certain design decisions throughout the game can make this an absolute chore at times, so I'm really conflicted when it comes to my overall thoughts on it. I do think that this is probably the strongest 2D Metal Gear title, but at the same time, I think that I might personally prefer Metal Gear 2 by just a hair. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Metal Gear Ghost Babel a 7.5. And with that, we've officially covered the last of the 2D games in the series. Thank you guys for stopping by, and I hope that you all enjoyed. This project has been an absolute blast so far, and I'm humbled by the amount of support that you guys have given it. If you're looking to get behind the scenes updates, early video access, and just support the channel in general, feel free to stop by my Patreon page. Everyone who contributes even just a little bit really goes a long way in allowing me to put more time into these videos and just generally supporting myself through them, and I can't thank you guys enough. If you're looking for any of the other videos in the series, you can check them out right here, and maybe you'd even be interested in another series we've been doing recently doing the exact same thing for the Ace Combat games. But once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys right here for the next Metal Gear review.